All right.
We're going.
We're good? All right, cool. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to Bsides. I'm probably going to end up running over my questions, so it's going to be supposed to be 20 minutes of talk and 10 minutes of questions. Probably going to run over that. So the talk is going to be on memory access violations, memory safety. It's going to be a high-level approach to it. So basically, for people that aren't programmers, they can understand, what is kind of crippling a lot of our stuff that's out there, and why these constant 0 days come out, these targeted attacks, where malware exploit kits come from, and such. So it's going to pretty much give you kind of a high-level view, understanding of all that. So start off, I'm going to give a high overview of the CPU and memory. I'm not going to talk about assembly. I know you guys probably look forward for a 30-minute talk of assembly, but unfortunately, no. Understanding non-memory safe languages, types of memory safety violations, and memory safety protection, like your OS level protection. So before I give the talk about how the low-level languages are kind of affecting everything, still it's important to understand that your high-level stuff, like your patch or prevention detection of signature-based prevention detection, access controls, patching, threat intelligence, and I guess encryption and data integrity, which is kind of like this whole chart. Those are all important. Even though they're a high-level approach, everything still applies. So to start off, does anyone know who this guy is? Anybody can take a guess? He's a theoretical physicist. He's also a professor. His name's Richard Feynman. He's discovered a lot of cool physics stuff, but he's also did a talk in 1985 called Richard Feynman Computer Heuristics Lecture. It's on YouTube. It's like an hour long. Basically goes from how a transistor works on a computer, very simple stuff, to basically how a CPU compares data, and then it goes into understanding heuristics and how a computer could create that. So an older video, but all that stuff still completely applies. The thing that I got out of that video that I really liked is basically he compared computers to a file clerk. Who actually at work still has a file clerk? That's because they were replaced by a computer. So essentially, this is another picture, and this is kind of good explanation of how CPU works. And I completely ganked this off of YouTube. I'm not even going to lie about it. How CPU works is the title of the video, even the play bar is there. But essentially, a CPU just takes in binary information, strings of characters, and from the memory and verifies it. It could be an instruction pointer. It could be just a random number value, a memory address, and the CPU, if it's an instruction pointer, it does its computation. So all it cares about is what this piece of data is and how it's going to interpret it. And the instruction pointer is essentially something that could be addition. So taken like a file clerk would, taking a card from the file cabinet and another card from another file cabinet, compare those two pieces of data and add them together, and then bam, you got your piece of information. That's what a CPU does. So it does addition, multiplication. It does also functions called like jump pointer to another address, pop data from the stack, which I'll explain the stack in a second. And then basically another one is fuse, negative, multiply, add of packed double precise floating point values. It's a fancy word for putting a bunch of numbers together in a matrix and doing math on them. So to elaborate how the memory stack looks, this is pretty much a 32-bit x86 Linux operating system. It'll vary, so if you have Windows, it may be a little different, not much at all. If you have a different processor, that like an ARM-based that's big endiness instead of little endiness, your memory stack is going to, instead of starting from the top, it's going to start from the bottom. But I'm going to go over each one of these real quick so you get an understanding, and then go from there to the actual attacks that you can do in the memory. So first is the operating system. Operating system is basically just a kind of a controller. So once it boots up, it recognizes that this is your hardware, how to take in inputs and outputs, how to schedule it in a timely manner, and that's pretty much your operating system in a nutshell. And next, you have your stack, which this looks amazing. I didn't get much breakfast this morning, so that looks really good. Your memory stack is basically just imagine it as a large scratch pad for execution. So you have in there last in, first out. So you got basically your stack pointer where you point to where you start the stack from, and you just basically take that information and keep popping in and out of data. And then going back, so we already did your kernel, which is your operating system, your stack. Now we're going to memory map segment, which is your shared libraries. So your shared libraries are essentially like your DLLs, your SO, lib files for your like Linux and Windows DLL. They're commonly used libraries. So if you're running like a VLC program and you're playing a video, you could actually pull a shared library for an MPEG compression. That's pretty much the gist of that. And then your heap is basically, just imagine it as a bunch of stretchable chalkboards. So you can basically allocate through malloc and calloc all of your different types of how much memory you want for this piece of data. It's not as fast, but it gives you a little bit different control. Your BSS segment, so I'll show this picture up here. Your BSS segment, which is initialized data. So basically when the program runs, executes, all those data are statically read-only. That's actually Elmer Fudge, since it's uninitialized 0 data blanks, it's Elmer Fudge shooting blanks. And then you got your text segment, which is basically your, did I skip over a slide? Data segment. Yeah, your data segment is below that, which is basically variables that you can write, global variables that you could actually change and address. And then your text segment is basically your executable, your bin, your bobs, that basically run and execute. So why should you care about low-level, kind of cut off, low-level languages? This is an older chart from 2013, but all these operating systems here are written in C and parts of assembly. So an operating system by nature has to be fast, efficient, and it has to be written in low-level language. A lot of this, like all this here, these are basically vulnerabilities that are constantly happening. And basically, why is C programming language broken? It's not really broken, it's just we assume too much. So, as I mentioned before, a computer is an elaborated file clerk. All it cares is this file cabinet card is what it needs, and it does that information. In a perfect world, it should only take in information that should be accepted. How do I word that? It should only take information that should correlate to the correct information. So anything that's malicious should be filtered out and dropped. Anything that shouldn't go to where it's supposed to, control flow integrity, should not go to where it's supposed to. But in C and C++, that doesn't happen. People write crappy code, people make exploits, things happen where they're not supposed to. And then thus the concept of, got a little feedback there. Thus the concept of smashing the stack for fun and profit began. There's a paper written in 1999, basically people using exploits. Start off with the first attack. So I'm going to go over different types of attacks so you understand it. Basically in here, you have a common, very common example of an attack. I'll explain in a second. So basically in here you have a buffer that you're creating. You're passing through, sorry, you got a buffer here that you're passing through data in there. The data, the payload, is 11 characters. Essentially it's 12 because you got your null character at the end. And so in the stack, because your C program doesn't care, it just wants the data and verify and carry on, your C program is going to write over 2 bytes of information over in the stack. So those could be in the stack that somebody else is pulling for another program, or the same program is going to be basically overwritten, could be a check variable for security, could be a piece of data, and that's how you get a buffer overflow. And then another type of attack, which is not as commonly used, which I'll explain in why, and there's how operating system protection prevents a lot of this stuff. It's called code injection, or command injection in a way. So code injection basically takes a piece of code that you write in the buffer in the stack, and then you basically take your execution pointer and point it to the stack, and it pops that piece of information, and then you have in that stack, you have like bin sh or some type of malicious payload in there. And that basically goes ahead and pops in the out there, and you got yourself a reverse shell, whatever you really want. This is basically, you can increase your level of success through a no-op sled. No-op is called a no operation. So basically in your memory, you can fill up as many buffers as you want with no-ops. So fill up a bunch of variables and pop them over. And then you basically slide your no-ops all the way to your shell code. So instead of actually knowing where your pointer is and how to execute your shell code, you can kind of cheat that system. Not a sled, not an OP sled, but another sled, random image. So buffer overread. And this is one that kind of happened recently and everyone freaked out. But, because obviously overreading something is never a bad thing. Because knowledge is power, right? Unless you're talking about all of your private keys to your corporation. So a good example of a buffer overread is Heartbleed. You're basically taking a value, kind of like a buffer overflow. A buffer overflow, you're taking a value and you're pulling it from the actual memory, but instead of writing to it, you're actually just calling a function to completely go over it. So in an operating system protection, you don't really have any checks on that because you're not doing anything malicious to the memory stack. And that's something that actually, these types of attacks have to be fixed by the programmer of the code. They can't be mitigated through OS protection. Who all read that wrong to begin with? Anybody? Come on. All right. So then you have another attack called dangling pointers. The dangling pointer is basically you have a null referenced variable, something that's been freed, and then you still access it. And when you basically access it, it gives a certain level of execution permission, and you get basically information leaks, execution of an arbitrary code. So you have ways to attack that way. I guess if I stand up here, I get echo. Your libc attack is actually successful. The one I talked about a few seconds ago, code injection, is not, which I'll explain in a few, but your libc attack is very similar, but you're basically filling your buffer with an address that you basically pop your pointer to and execute it. So you're basically, you're taking your buffer, you're filling it up with a memory address, and you're pointing a value to that shared memory call. So you're actually executing something that's not in the stack, that's not supposed to be executable. You're referencing something in a shared library that you could actually pass a malicious payload through. So you're actually mitigating around that in a different way. It's a very similar concept. You're basically creating something in the memory and popping it over there and executing it, but in a different approach. So now we understand how things are broken. I'm going to explain basically your memory safe protections and common ways against it. I'm going to go over shortly with Windows side of things. Well, first I'm going to explain the common practices. Then I'm going to go over to the Windows side of things, and then basically your open source side. So your NX bit, your no execute bit. So basically it's this function in your CPU. Intel is called XD bit. AMD is called advanced virus protection. ARM is XN. Now this stuff's been out for a while. It's been like 2003, maybe even before. I'm not even sure. Basically, your OS assigns a part of the memory that is not executable. So basically, your memory, when it calls a value and try to pop something in there, the CPU has this check saying in there, well, this should never be executed in this range of memory. And your OS basically creates controls of that. In Windows, it's called DEP. You can emulate it through write or XOR or Zex Shield. This is bypassed through that libc attack because you're essentially in libc, you're referencing a shared memory variable, and you're passing data through that. But the actual code injection attacks are mitigated through this because you're injecting something in the stack, you're popping something that shouldn't be popped, and executing something that shouldn't be executed, and therefore you get your attack. Another thing is called stack canaries. So in your program, you basically have this picture here. In your program, you have your user stack, and when the program runs, it's going to actually, once it starts loading variables in the stack, it's going to give it a certain amount. It's going to layer random information, random characters that it knows what it is. So basically, when you do a buffer overflow, you're actually overwriting parts of that it should see that as a static variable that never changes. And then it's going to instantly know that your program has been maliciously compromised. It'll kill the program. So the good thing about that is instead of having a maliciously compromised program that's constantly exploiting and you never know, these attacks go on for years, stuff like that, your program will start dying. And then you can look in the logs and verify what's going on. Why is this program dying? Well, that's because, China attacked it or something. That's stack canaries. ASLR, address space layout randomization, is basically taking your whole memory stack or parts of your memory stack, depends on how far you go into ASLR, and you're randomizing it. So your actual guess of knowing where your binary blobs are, what programs you can reference, where your shared libraries are, become exponentially harder. So you actually taking a piece of data and popping it over and running that, you're mitigating against those types of attacks. Now, who in their corporation uses Emmet or heard of Emmet before? Anyway, oh wait, sorry, wrong Emmett. Enhanced Mitigation Experience Toolkit. So basically, in Windows, you could run this toolkit free of charge, and it basically gives you a certain capability. You can force all of your programs to have data execution prevention by default. You could have structure exception handling over write protection. Essentially, if you have a way to bypass the structured exception handling, you have a way to bypass the stack canaries. So those actual random variables in the stack are now kind of pointless. And then you have your ASLR forcing on all applications. There's other features in here I won't go over, but those are basically the three main things that are in OS protection. And by doing this, you're basically forcing all that stuff to be enabled for all programs. This image I stole from TrustedSec. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if anybody's from here. There's a good guide on their website how to install it. Straightforward. Another one, which I'm not going to go talk about at other vendors, but this is the only one I've seen so far that actually a malware company that supports DEP, ASLR, out of box, and also some additional functions that you may not get out of Emmet. With this, you basically get, they also provide a layer 3 application behavior prevention, which basically in Java, it's an interpreted language. It's a layer 3, it's not on the operating system. It has ways to say that, okay, this Java program is going to a lower level. Let's stop that. So this has that and additional rules. I'm not going to go much into that. Linux side. So basically in Linux, when you compile your code, which is not really, because distros have their option to compile code. It's random. It's, some do it, some don't. Basically with this, if you compile your code with Pi, position independent executable, you get the ability to have your binary blobs completely randomized through ASLR. Without that, you don't have that option to do that. So it's up to a lot of these distros to start upping their game and actually supporting that. Also, in here you got your F-stack protector. It's kind of common, but that's basically your stack canaries in GCC. Now in Windows, you also have your /GS in Visual Studios. That's been enabled by default. Props to them since like 2003. So your stack canaries, if it's written in Visual Studio since 2003, it's pretty much has stack canaries. I don't know much about the distros because they're all they don't really show which one has stack canaries enabled. But I still don't think it's a very common thing. Still, there's some things that are not. They don't have position independent or stack canaries. Another thing to go over is GR security packs on Linux side. GR security is a kind of I guess you can consider a superset of packs. It's basically an add-on feature. Packs is basically your OS protection. GR security is additional controls that you get that you won't get in your vanilla kernel. The only problem is out-of-bound kernel. So a lot of distros do not support this at all. And the ones that kind of support it pretty well is your Gentoo, Ipfire, Alpine Linux. So very smaller, like embedded ones, and then also Gentoo. With this, you get basically proper memory segmentation. So they have their own like rewrites of their actual memory segmentation. So you could actually incorporate stack canaries, ASLR a lot better. It also affects the user space and kernel. I don't think the vanilla kernel does ASLR on its own OS. They assume that nobody's going to pop in the operating system. Then also with GR security, you have chroot, which is something that BSD users brag about. It's your jail. chroot restrictions, your jail. This actually gives you that capability. It also supports a RBAC. It's kind of like SE Linux. Who knows SE Linux or uses it? So basically in SE Linux, you have your, instead of your discretionary controls in Linux, where you have your read, write, execute, and your groups, stuff like that, you basically have in your mandatory access control in SE Linux and also your RBAC and GR security, the options to basically create separate groups. So like Apache gets compromised, a program, it's not going to have free reign to all the other stuff. It's only going to have a certain scope that it's going to see. The RBAC and GR security is optional. So you have the option if you want to run GR security just because of the PAX functions for your DEP, ASLR, additional stack canary preventions. You could actually run GR security and SE Linux side by side if you don't like the GR security version of their access controls. Another topic to go over is 64-bit entropy. So everyone assumes that when you're running a 64-bit memory spacing, that you got this large, vast amount of memory that running ASLR, you should never be having an issue with the guessing game to guess a bunch of memory addresses. The problem is that's kind of true in a way, but not. 64-bit memory spacing is essentially 16 exabytes of data. So that's a whole lot of data. That's like 1 million terabytes. But that's not true because AMD 64-bit or x86-64, even though they're the ones that created it, their max spec is 52 megabytes, or 52 bits. You can never go beyond 52 bits in AMD 64 of physical address spacing. So by that default, you have 4 petabytes instead of 16 exabytes. The other thing is that most processors don't really ever support much more than that. Your Intel processors, like your Core 2, your I series, up to Haswell, so up to like 2014, are 32-bit physical memory address spacing. That's 64 gigs of RAM that you have guessing games with. Then you also have your Intel Haswell, which is basically 39 bits, so you got a little bit more entropy. AMD, I think, does have a bit more, but really 64-bit entropy is not as much as you want on the guessing games. What, 5? Yeah, I'm going to run over a little bit. Oh, 5 in total? Okay. So the issue is that there are many types of attack methods. There's ways to prevent them through this, but they're not all foolproof. You could have your best thing. You have ASLR fully supported, DEP fully supported, stack canaries, but there is still ways around these memory attacks. It's really up to 2 things. One is people start writing better code to implement security. Security really wasn't concerned until like late 1990s, 1999s, and later because most people are like, oh, we'll just write a bunch of code, it won't happen, people won't do buffer overflows. And then things like Sasserworm, Blaster, SQL, Slammer, all these things started coming out, compromising millions of dollars of corporate environments. So it's up to really the academia to start actually teaching this from the get-go. It's also up to programmers to start utilizing things properly. Start doing by default things like static code analysis and fuzz testing on their code, which isn't still foolproof. And then also start implementing things that are more memory-safe languages. Swift, Go, Rust are all newer languages that basically are kind of lower level, so you have a lot more control, a lot more speed and functionality, but it removes that ability to write crappy code and have these types of attacks. It still happens, but it removes a lot more. You basically have 2 sides, your control and writing fast code and your security. The more closer you're to security, obviously, the less control you get. And then that's pretty much it. Go with questions. If anybody has any right now? Nope, all right. All right, thank you very much. Thank you.
Good job, man.
Thank you.
Good job. Not nervous at all. You couldn't even tell it was the first time going.
Thank you. Sure we get there soon. You're up next, aren't you? I'll pass the torch. Here, I'll move my laptop for you. If you had it set up right here. If you want to set up right here, plug that in. Are you both talking then?
What's that?
You both talking? Are you both,
Yeah.
both of you? I got one mic. See if Justin. And also, there's a lot of feedback when you stand right here. So I try to hold this slide, walk away. Here, hold this. Hold this off.